And I think over the evolution from Mao to Deng to Zhang to Hu, you saw a fairly steady progression, a steady evolution in the kinds of leaders leading China. And you saw that evolution. They became more consensus oriented, less one person in charge, more collective decision making. That was sort of a pattern over time. Of course, in 1989 with the Tiananmen incidents, that was interrupted a bit. But basically, the pattern was towards more consensus building, more norms like only serving 2 terms if you're president, retirement ages, and also educational level generally continually went up. And you saw over time the dominance of engineers. And engineers are problem solvers. They try to define the problem in technical terms, define the alternatives, find the most optimal decision, and so forth. So I think that was the evolution of leadership really until Xi Jinping. And I think on almost all of those grounds, he's gone in an opposite or certainly a very different direction. Less consensus leadership, less observant of norms. He's not an engineer. He is building what I think is fair to describe a personal-oriented leadership system, more emphasis on propaganda, less emphasis on the market economy, which all the previous leaders had more. So I think while we originally were uncertain about the nature of Xi Jinping, I think it's become clear he's a very different leader than his predecessors. And in many respects, you might say he is more recognizable as a Leninist leader and a traditional Chinese style leader. So I think that you cannot overestimate the difference that the changing character of the leaders or the leader in China is. Now, of course, there are many other things that determine how China behaves in the world. It's not just because of the changing leader, although that's an important factor, but it has to do with China's growing economic power. China can do more things in the world for good or not so good. Also, China has more interests in the world to protect. It has literally hundreds of thousands of people, Chinese people, living in unstable parts of the world, Middle East, Central Asia in particular. So there are many things that account for changing Chinese behavior, but I think the leader is very important, and this is a very different leader than his immediate predecessors. In the evolution from Deng Xiaoping to Jiang Zemin, and Hu Jintao's a little complicated, but basically I would include him in this. China became more adept at dealing with pluralism. You saw the rise of civic society organizations, non-governmental organizations, intellectuals, while certainly not free in the Western sense, were much more outspoken and candid during Jiang Zemin's era and Hu Jintao's. So I would say Xi Jinping's predecessors weren't what we'd call democratic personalities particularly, although I think Jiang Zemin, given his experience and Western style education in China, did have some democratic proclivities, but I wouldn't call him a democratic leader. But I would say China's leaders became more adept in taking into account and balancing different social forces, and did pay more attention to experts, paid more attention to intellectuals, gave a bigger role to the private sector. You'll note Xi Jinping is even clamping down on Jack Ma and Alibaba. Well, Jiang Zemin wouldn't have done that. So So I tend to use the word democracy sparingly because it does have a precise meaning. But I think, the US or the West, we can live with a governance that takes into account pluralism. So I think the current storyline in the United States and maybe elsewhere is that engagement failed. That we engaged with China. China became strong, but it did not share our purposes and did not become more cooperative. Now, there certainly is a problem. China's not as cooperative as it used to be. So I'm not challenging the current situation. But I think that engagement in very many respects was successful. I would say yes, but I would say more importantly, it has been adjusted all along in the last 40 years. And admittedly, the current requirements seem to call for a bigger adjustment. But engagement, while it went on, let us just say from Nixon's visit to let us say, Xi Jinping. During that period, there were major adjustments. When Nixon went to China, the adjustment was to move towards cooperation with China to oppose the Soviet Union. Then Deng Xiaoping came along, and the engagement was enlarged to include economic cooperation and military. Chinese military in 1989 are still in effect today. And then, of course, after Deng Xiaoping took his 1992 trip south, as they call it in China, reform was reignited. China joined the WTO, and the U.S. pushed very hard for China's integration into the international economy. And then along came, the global financial crisis. The U.S. had its own economic problems, and China was seen as helping the world economy. And also in the global war on terror, China was seen as useful and not terribly important, but on balance, helpful. And then Xi Jinping comes along, and we see retreat on the economic front. We see retreat on domestic governance. And of course, Congress has been passing legislation all along. When Hong Kong reverted to the mainland, we had the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act, which basically said we're going to keep an eye on what China does in Hong Kong. And then, of course, we know what's happened in Hong Kong. So I think it's, in a sense, to talk about engagement as a 40-year period, in one sense, that's reasonable. But on the other hand, engagement changed all along the way. And so what we're now is just to the next, I would say, bigger change than many of the previous ones. But this has not been a static, unrealistic policy. Our engagement policy has always taken into account what's happening in China, what's happening in the world, what are the interests of the United States. So I very much disagree with the idea that the engagement policy failed or was naive. It's not true. Our allies, there are two things to say. One is our allies are not sure how long-lived this new American-China policy will be. Our allies aren't sure how long our policy will be able to continue in a stable direction. And they don't want to sign on to a policy that's going to change. So that's the first thing. Secondly, China is the biggest trading partner of far more countries in the world than the US is. So on the one hand, people have their security worries about China. They have their human rights worries about China. But on the other hand, they have their economic interests, which argue get along with China. I mean, even Taiwan wants to keep the economic gravy train going while it protects its security. So It's not going to be easy, but generally speaking, China's 20% of the world's population growing at somewhere between 6 and 8%. That buys you a lot of friends. I don't think China wants to dominate the world. I think China wants to live in a world where it has a lot of influence and it can veto actions that it sees as very damaging to its national interest. So, and I think China wants to make itself the hub of the Asia economy for sure, and perhaps the global economy. China wants to be able to veto actions it finds inimical to its core interests. And it wants to make sure that the countries around it are not allied against it. But I don't think that, on the other hand, I don't think China is so unrealistic as to want to dominate the world. First of all, the minute you have that as your goal, nobody's your friend. I think China just wants to get stronger, more influential, be able to veto central policies that might develop elsewhere inimical to its interests. But I think we have to be a little realistic. China's leaders know they've got severe problems. You're just reading now the demographic problem. China's getting older faster than previous predictions, which means it's going to have internal welfare, social security, medical costs. China's got huge problems. All this infrastructure China has built over the last 2 decades, it was all built at one time. It means it's going to fall apart at the same time, right? So at the same time, we realize we have problems, and we got big problems. We, the West, Taiwan, US, we have big problems. But we shouldn't make the mistake of thinking China has no problems. And my own view is that China would be better off dealing with its problems than causing anxiety all around it. What's happened in US-China relations, and this very much affects Taiwan, is that for much of the engagement period from Nixon through at least the first Obama administration, the basic policy of the United States was to reassure China. And China's basic policy was to reassure the West that it would not be a troublemaker. Remember, China talked about peaceful rise. The United States in that era said, we have an interest in a strong, stable, united China. Well, China's not talking about peaceful rise anymore, really. And we're not talking about the desire for a strong China. So what we've moved is from a policy of a reassurance to a policy of deterrence, threatening China to not use its coercive ability, whether it's economic coercion, as has happened against Taiwan, cutting off tourists from China to Taiwan or reducing the flow and so forth, and certainly military coercion, the recent flights in the Taiwan Strait of Chinese aircraft and so forth. So we've gone from reassurance to deterrence, and we're talking about moving more military force in that direction. We've talked about the strategic importance of Taiwan. We've talked about, note that when our Secretary of State just recently went to Asia, the first 2 stops were our allies, Japan and South Korea. And and if you say we've moved towards deterrence, what that really means is we've moved towards threat, because deterrence is all about threat. It's threatening the other party so they don't do what you fear they might do if they aren't threatened. But of course, threats can be provocative as well as inducing caution. So you have to be careful with threats, and you also have to make sure the other party believes you're strong. And the danger of the current environment is that I think the Chinese see themselves as they say, China rising, America declining. So this is very dangerous, where the U.S. Or either party uses more threat, but does not have a realistic appreciation of the other's power. And the fact of the matter is the U.S. is powerful. Now the question is, do we have the will? And that's hard to prove until the event happens. But I think we're in a very dangerous moment where China thinks it's pretty strong, thinks the U.S. is declining, thinks the U.S. is preoccupied, whether it's in Central Asia or the Middle East, or through its own domestic problems. We have our domestic security problems in a way that we in the United States have not had for a long time. I think of January 6th and the threat to state capitals around the country. So I think there's a danger China will, and partly for its own domestic reasons, the party wants to build legitimacy by reunifying with Taiwan to build domestic legitimacy. And I think many people are concerned that they may misjudge the capability and will of the United States to have a peaceful resolution.